ladies and gentlemen, Professor Myles Allen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, and by the way, in the interests of fake in this year, these days of fake news, I was given credit by the BBC for being the person behind net zero, which I'll take it, but there were lots of people involved. I think so. It is anyway. So I want to talk this evening to you about carbon offsetting. It's probably the topic that we interact with net zero most directly when you're taking a flight or something and you come across the little box you can tick, and there's an implausibly small amount of money, you can tick the box and somehow your flight is magically carbon neutral. And so the question we want to ask is, does this really work? What is it? What's going on? What's the and should we even be thinking about this at all? I'd like to think this is actually a topic that Thomas Gresham himself would have found relatively familiar back in 15, whatever it was, because, we'll come on to some analogies as we go along. So, first of all, you may be surprised to say that actually my ultimate message is carbon offsetting is actually very important. It's actually essential, carbon offsetting, for us to achieve net zero at an affordable cost. And I'll explain why. But of course, the problem is, we need carbon offsetting, but not as we know it, so to speak. I mean, much of the current carbon offsetting industry, and it is a flourishing industry, probably does more harm than good. And the main problem is not actually, as it were, on the sell side in terms of the projects that are being offered, many of which are perfectly valid and useful things to be done, but the buy side, so to speak, the impression that it gives to people that, for a few quid you can net out your impact. And that's the harm that I think we need to worry about. So how do we fix it? I mean, how do we fix the carbon offsetting industry? And by the way, before I start, in another point about full disclosure, I am on the science advisory board of a company called Puro.earth, which is it's a sort of trading platform for removal-based credits and removal-based offsets. So I think I should sort of mention that. Puro.earth focuses on, they would argue this, but I believe it is true. I'm on their advisory board. They specialize in high-quality, permanent carbon removal offsets. You'll see as the course of this lecture goes on, that's kind of where we need to converge towards. They also happen to be rather expensive offsets, so that's the edge of the market that the Puro.earth are operating in. Now, I mean, it's been around. It's also been laughed at for quite a long time. It's quite easy to find cartoons about carbon offsetting on the web. And as I was saying, Thomas Gresham would probably be quite familiar with the idea of paying somebody else to pray for you, or to sort of, if you've sinned, you can sort of go and give the priest some money and have your sins. So here's somebody saying, "Forgive me, I've SUV'd." It's obviously an American, and then the chap in the tie is just saying, "Well, go thy way, their sins are offset." So this idea of paying somebody else to reduce their emissions for you, but I will try and explain to you how this does actually make sense. So we should don't just scoff at the idea. That's sort of one of the issues. The other issue is it's so bewildering, and that's what this other cartoon illustrates. You can go in. It's a forest of options. You can pay somebody to fit solar panels. You can pay somebody to develop wind turbines. Pay somebody else to plant trees, and so on. And it's a very confusing marketplace, a very confusing topic, and there's therefore plenty of scope for, to be perfectly honest, snake oil sales. I mean, there's plenty of carbon offset schemes out there that look great, are very photogenic, and maybe not achieving very much. So, I mean, this was the situation I mean, the offsetting industry grew up really with the climate issue. It was growing up through the 2000s. Both of these cartoons are actually quite old. I was interested to see sort of how far back it is that people have been laughing at the offsetting industry, and certainly for the past 20 years, you can find people sort of sniping at this whole idea. There was a big effort following the Paris Agreement in 2015 to try and organize and regularize and rationalize the offsetting industry, or what's called the voluntary carbon market. And this effort was led by Mark Carney. Here's Mark Carney. If the polls are correct, he's quite likely to become the next leader of the Liberal Party in Canada, and very possibly Canada's next Prime Minister. So good luck to him. He's got difficult things on his plate at the moment. But one of the one of the many initiatives he was the former governor of the Bank of England, but after he's always been very focused on the climate issue, and recognized the fact that the carbon offsetting industry was a bit of a shambles in the run-up to Paris, and there was a big initiative, this so-called Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, to try and pull it together and establish, what an offset needed to be. So here he is at COP21. I have no idea what he's actually saying, but he's saying voluntary carbon markets need to depend on core carbon principles. So they try to establish some core carbon principles that a genuine offset needs to adhere to. So that's Mark being very serious, and of course he's chatting to somebody else who was about to become the leader of actually not about to become the next but one leader of the Conservative Party, who was just more excited about the fact that it was going to become a very valuable industry, perhaps. Who knows what was actually going. And there's a lot of skepticism, and I quite like this. She's sort of behind them going, really, what's going on here? Anyway, so I'd like to talk you through how the carbon offsetting industry works. And we've been thinking about this quite a bit in Oxford. It's a particular topic. I mean, by the way these lectures have progressed, we're sort of getting more and more controversial as we get towards the end of these lectures. I mean, I started off 3 years ago on the science, which was reasonably uncontentious. Then we got on to the impacts and valuing carbon impacts and so on, valuing the impacts of climate change. A little bit more controversial. As we get towards the sort of the crux of these lectures, I mean, the next one's going to be on veganism. It's not going to get more controversial than that. Anyway, but this one, we found we in Oxford stepped into the carbon offsetting space with the publication in 2021, I think it was, of the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, which initially were just an effort by the university to rationalize our own view on offsetting, because Oxford has a net zero commitment. By 2035, we're going to try and be net zero. We've included all of the flights that people take coming to Oxford to do our courses, and so we recognize there's absolutely no way that these people, that students will be able to fly carbon neutral by 2035. So if we're actually going to do this, there's going to have to be an element of offsetting involved. So how would that actually work? How can we, as an institution, make sense of offsetting? So we then, having sort of thought about this ourselves, we just put these principles up on the web, and it's triggered a huge amount of interest, lots of comment, lots of feedback. We reissued them in 2024 with some sort of minor modifications to things that people were particularly upset about. So it's clearly, there's many raw nerves in this space, and I hope I'm not going to get sued for anything I say this evening, but it's certainly a very sensitive topic. But the taxonomy, one of the things we did, the sort of perhaps the least controversial thing we suggested, was basically a way of dividing up carbon offsets and describing the different types of carbon offsets that are out there. Broadly speaking, at the top level, we can divide offsets into emission reduction offsets, which, as David said, that this is paying somebody else to not emit, to compensate for the fact that you propose to emit. And then carbon removal offsets, on the other hand, where you're paying somebody to remove the carbon from the atmosphere that you've emitted. And these, broadly speaking, you could argue each of these is a way of achieving net zero impact, although you can see that there's there's a bit of a fundamental difference between them. And within these categories, we've got, by the way, the sort of shading here it refers to the permanence, if you like, or the risk of reversal of the intervention that we're describing, that we're talking about. Category 1 is actually the vast bulk of offsets at the moment, is the idea of avoiding emissions or reducing emissions by renewable energy projects or energy efficiency and so on. Category 2 is avoiding emissions from deforestation, so slowing deforestation. Category 3 is the idea of basically avoiding emissions by capturing carbon and putting it back underground. We'll talk a little bit more about that idea as we go along. And then on the carbon removal side, you'll notice there's a sort of, it's more of a spectrum of permanence there. And the two big distinctions are whether you're removing carbon to the biosphere, to trees, plants, soils, and so on, to store the carbon at the Earth's surface, or whether you're removing carbon and storing it in the geosphere. So these are the big categories of offsetting that we were dividing up, and we're going to start off by the way, full disclosure, many people will complain, you shouldn't call them carbon offsets anymore, they're carbon credits. I get a bit sort of fed up with renaming things because they're unpopular. But certainly everybody in the industry likes to talk about carbon credits, not carbon offsets. But that's largely because carbon offsets became a bit of a joke, and so they just renamed them. And I actually think it's the same thing as far as I'm concerned. No doubt there will be somebody online who will protest vitriolically that it's not quite the same thing. But as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty much the same thing. Okay, so let's start off talking about emission reduction offsets. As I say, these are the vast bulk of the offsets you buy at the moment, and indeed the vast bulk of that vast bulk are these avoided emissions offsets. And this is this idea of paying somebody else to not emit as a way of compensating for the fact that you're continuing to emit yourself. Now, many people sort of hear this and think, well, that's ridiculous. How can that possibly make any sense? So the first thing, open your mind. Don't, engage with this, because it does actually make in principle, it does make sense. And the reason it makes sense is because there's a huge range of costs of reducing emissions. So this sort of rather bewildering looking graph behind me is what we call a marginal abatement cost curve. And bear with, I'll explain it, talk you through it. Basically, it's the cost of reducing emissions if sort of no reductions at all is on your left, and then we're reducing emissions all the way down to 100%. So if we wanted to reduce our emissions to net zero immediately or this decade, we'd have to do a number of different things. We'd have to switch coal to gas, we'd have to switch gas to renewables and so on. Those are the orange bars there. We'd have to deal with transport, there's the dark blue. We'd have to do something about many industries and so on. And so you can see each of these little blocks, the width of the block is the amount of emissions you could reduce in the global economy. This is the global figure. And by the way, this is Goldman Sachs' idea of what this might look like. I mean, we can quibble about exactly what the numbers are, but it illustrates the point. And I think we can agree it's going to be something like this shape. So there's the height of each little block is the cost per ton of carbon that it would cost you to do whatever it is that saves that amount of emissions. So one of these might be, replacing coal, switching coal to gas. That would be a relatively cheap thing to do. It's something we've already done in the UK, could be done in the rest of the world as well, would save quite a lot of emissions. And that's probably one of the big sort of early orange blocks over on the left, which are relatively cheap in a cost, less than $100 per ton of CO2 avoided. And then, as you work along, you see those big blue, dark blue sections, and those are the cost of, for example, decarbonizing transport. So it's changing your transport system to electric and using renewable energy to power the electric transport system. That costs much more per ton of carbon avoided. And then you can see there's also some very high costs there for buildings. And indeed, for example, come back to the example of University of Oxford, we have a lot of, as you might imagine, pretty difficult to insulate buildings that we're dealing with in Oxford. And they won't allow us to double glaze them. They won't, there's all sorts of issues with, because these are medieval buildings, so we can't necessarily mess around with them too much. And actually, so the cost of decarbonizing the building stock of Oxford is actually very high. It's up in the hundreds of pounds per ton. And so that sort of brings this home. So what this does, it allows you to sort of sort out the different measures you could take to reduce emissions. From on the left, the sort of no-brainers. These are things you can do to reduce emissions, don't really cost almost nothing. And then all the way through to the, whoa, that's going to be expensive, which is sort of the noise our long-suffering estates managers see when they see the bills for decarbonising the university estate. And by the way, over here, this big grey fuzzy area, that's what Goldman Sachs reckons is non-abatable with current conservation technologies, I should have said. So those are the things where we can't really avoid generating the carbon dioxide at all. And these are processes like cement production, for example, where generating CO2 is just intrinsic to the process that you're dealing with. So the reason behind emission reduction offsets, the reason they do actually make sense, even though it's relatively easy to sneer at them, is the area of these boxes is the amount of money you would spend achieving that outcome, okay? Because the height is the pounds per ton, horizontal is number of tons you could save, so pounds per ton, number of tons, that's the total amount of money you spend. So far, so good. So look at the area, for example, of the dark blue. That's what it costs to decarbonize mostly road transport and shipping. I think the extra dark blue, the even higher one, is decarbonizing aviation. You could take that money, okay, you take all that cash, okay, that you might spend on decarbonizing transport and use it to avoid all those emissions, because the area is the same. So for a relatively small amount of emissions, decarbonizing transport, we can get a huge impact if we offset. That's the idea behind avoided emissions offsetting. So it does make sense as a way of maximizing the impact of our expenditure on reducing emissions, as fast as possible. And so, this is the case for emission reduction offsets, is that if you sort of look at these numbers, and if you take these numbers at face value, for less than the cost of decarbonizing transport, things like aviation, road transport and shipping, which amounts to about 20% of global emissions, or for less than the activities that amount to 20% of global emissions, we could eliminate 50% of global emissions if we focus that money instead on power, on industry and agriculture, particularly in developing countries where much of the power industry, much of the power sector is relatively inefficient and could be decarbonized relatively cheaply. And, it's often pointed out we could save many lives in the meantime by doing things like making cooking more efficient in developing countries and replacing open fires with more efficient stoves. In fact, one of the you'll find if you go onto any airline website, they love these efficient cook stove programs. And by the way, full disclosure, I actually started my career designing fuel-efficient cook stoves in Kenya. So it's interesting sort of coming, so I just finished my undergrad degree and I was out there. And it's interesting sort of coming full circle to this, because I remember at the time, and looking at this picture, we were running up against, the idea of the project I was involved in was to try and save trees. My job was to try and quantify how much we were saving trees. And I found it extremely difficult, largely because we never saw things like that left-hand picture. Fuel wood is valuable in Kenya. You would never see a great stack of stuff like that burning away, a lot of those flames nowhere near the pots. You know, when people were quantifying the impact of these fuel-efficient cook stoves, you know, you get some muppet like me sort of trying to operate an open fire and then comparing it to the performance of the cook stove, you're going to find a huge saving. But actually, if you looked at the amount of fuel wood the largely women of Kenya were using to cook on open fires, it was remarkably low. And so it's the dead giveaway here. As you can see those sort of chopped up bits of pine there. This is obviously some fire that, I don't know, some volunteer like me had gone and built to take a photograph of. That's not, so the serious point about this is, what's the counterfactual? How much would get used, you know, and how much are you actually therefore saving by replacing by replacing open fires with cook stoves? And that's the big challenge with these kind of energy efficiency projects. You know, it's a very specific example, but in all of them, that's the kind of problem you have. Is what would have happened if you hadn't intervened? But you know, that said, of course, and this is why I guess there's been so much tension around the publication of the Oxford Principles, is we got a lot of feedback from people saying we were dissing these cook stove projects, and did you not realize they were saving, these projects are saving lives, and you know, saving women's lungs and so on, because you know, if you do something about the indoor fumes and so on, you can actually have it. And you know, okay, that's fair, but the point is, it's not being sold as a life-saving project. It's being sold as a carbon-saving project, and that's the issue we have with many of these projects. Is they have many co-benefits. They're valuable projects in themselves, but actually working out the carbon they're saving is quite difficult, and therefore working out whether it's true for the offset buyer to say they've achieved net zero because they've bought this offset. That's where the problem comes. It's not that the projects themselves are not good things. It's whether the buyers really should be declaring themselves net zero because they've invested in them. And so this is, you know, the case against emission reduction offsets is, and this is where you can sort of get onto sort of real fundamentals here. What an emission reduction, what a efficient offset market does is it allows you to identify all the low-cost emission reduction opportunities first. So you do the cheap stuff first. And every economist will tell you, well, that's great, because the discounted cost of your emission reductions is then lower because you've postponed all the expensive stuff. Okay? So you keep your economists happy, but you might sort of slightly piss off your kids because you've postponed all of the expensive stuff onto the next generation. So you've only done the cheap stuff. You know, we've decarbonized, we've got halfway to net zero doing really cheap stuff. We haven't bothered to do any of the expensive stuff. It's the next generation's problem to do that. So that's where, you know, the fundamental economics of this starts to break down a bit. And, you know, we do have to ask ourselves, you know, does offsetting actually cut the cost of achieving net zero, or does it just redistribute it over time? In the really big picture, does it just sort of mean that we sort of postpone the expensive stuff by using offsets to avoid it? And one argument that people might make, that might be made, that it does cut the total cost is this. So back to this cost curve here. again, this is Goldman Sachs' cost curve, how it's evolved over time. And so, of course, this is their estimate of costs. So whether these are true cost reductions, we don't know. But in Goldman Sachs' view, back in 2019, they thought it would cost $700 or $800 a ton to reduce emissions by 75% or so. By 2023, with sort of new developments in battery technology and in various wind and solar and so on, they're reckoning we could get more like sort of 85% or so to the way to net zero with that sort of, you can see the blue to red to pale blue to orange, there's a sort of movement down at the high end. So these high-end costs of reducing emissions are coming down. So if that's the case, then that's a really strong argument for offsetting, because if the expensive stuff is going to get cheaper in the future, then yes, deal with the cheap stuff now, and then deal with the expensive stuff later when it's cheaper to do so. But the challenge for that, of course, is that, again, any economist will tell you, or at least another group of economists would tell you, that the technology costs come down because we do them, because we build them, because we deploy them, because we actually learn how to do stuff. You could argue that if the world's drivers had just bought offsets rather than buying electric cars and building, if the world's motor industry had just, there was a little while ago you could buy, if you bought a Land Rover, it was carbon neutral for 40,000 miles. I don't know if you remember those adverts. Land Rover just offset your emissions for the first 40,000 miles driving. Of course, that was one of these offset transactions that Land Rover did, and they just built that into the cost of the vehicle. So if all the car companies had done that, had addressed their net zero challenge by just buying offsets, then, we'd all still be driving exactly the same cars we were driving 10 years ago, and we wouldn't be making that progress at the top end. So I would argue, actually, that the danger with offsetting is it does backload these expensive initiatives, these expensive innovations, where we need, we really have a sort of moral duty, really, to be spending the money on these expensive things now in order to be learning how to do it, in order to be driving down the costs so that, we actually do achieve it. And then, of course, there's the counterfactual challenge that I mentioned with the wood stove projects. And this is, one which Bloomberg did a big sort of expose on this. So various companies have produced net zero claims that essentially, according to Bloomberg, and there's pretty good evidence behind their analysis, are based on projects that probably made economic sense anyway. So if you're developing a renewable energy project in a developing country, you're replacing a coal-fired power plant with a wind or solar, you'd be an idiot not to sell offsets on the back of it, because people will pay you to do that, even though actually wind and solar is now, in many countries, cost competitive with coal anyway. So that's sort of one of the fundamental problems. Of course, offset providers will jump and say, no, we always ensure, and there's a whole industry of offset certifiers, by the way, out there, who sort of check these providers and so on. And one of the things they always insist on is there should be additionality. This is the jargon word for this project wouldn't have happened anyway. So they can insist that the project is additional, and there are various tests to see whether that's true. But in the end, it still comes down to, you're asking somebody, would you have done this anyway? And they'll say, no, because if they say yes, then they know they won't get the offset. So, there's obviously quite a lot of incentive to say no at that point. And the other slightly more fundamental problem is that if a project is marginal, like it's sort of, you're weighing up whether to do it. So it's almost viable, but not quite. And then, but you get an offset payment, that definitely makes it viable. So then the offset provider would say, yes, this is clearly additional because the project wouldn't have happened anyway, But the way it works in the offsetting industry is the offset provider then takes credit for all of the savings made by that project, even though the project was kind of on the verge of being economically viable in the first place. So you can see this is the convention out there. And as a result, these kind of projects are very, very cheap because there's lots of projects out there where the economics almost stack up but not quite, and those tend to be the ones that attract the offset market because then, of course, you can buy an offset for a huge amount of carbon for a very small amount of money because all you have to do is contribute a little bit of money just to take the project finances over the edge and make the whole thing work. So it does mean that projects are happening that wouldn't have happened anyway, but the idea that somehow this reflects the cost of reducing emissions is a bit misleading because, of course, there's lots of other incentives layered in there as well. To come back to our taxonomy, the other big area, the other main source of offsets at the moment, if you tick the box when you buy a flight, it'll be either an emission reduction offset based on renewable energy probably, or it'll be avoided emissions from deforestation. I could wander off, but I'm not very good at it, into jargon here, and there's a forest of jargon of REDD+ and so on, all that sort of thing. I'm not going to pretend to give you all that, but this is the idea that if you prevent deforestation, prevent loss of carbon from the biosphere, then you've avoided some emissions, and then that's another about 25% or so of offsets are of this form. Again, big articles last year came out from The Guardian and Die Zeitung, sort of collaboration of journalists with a bunch of academics, groups of academics as well, looking at these avoided deforestation offsets, and they came to the conclusion, hotly contested by the offset providers, that 90% of the offsets certified by Verra, which is the main offset certifying platform, VRRA, they were 90% of them were essentially worthless. And the argument was, and these are the forest-based offsets, and the argument was that they were based on unsubstantiated or unsubstantiable comparisons between areas of land where it was claimed that some deforestation had been prevented by comparing one area with another area, but when they went and delved into it, they found results like the one illustrated behind me. So in this particular case that they pulled out to illustrate the point, that purple area, it's an area of Peru which was defined by an offset project to say we're going to protect this rainforest in Peru. And there's been almost no deforestation in that region. And then they compared that to the neighboring region, the green area, where there had been deforestation. So they then calculated the amount of tons of carbon that would have happened if the same rate of deforestation had happened in the green area as happened in the purple area, came up with the number of tons saved, and that was what they claimed was the offset was worth in terms of tons of carbon. But as was pointed out in this article, the reference area here contains a river and a road and a town, all of which are basically provide the communications required for logging to take place and deforestation to take place. So they argued that this wasn't a like-for-like comparison, and that somehow the project had chosen a really inaccessible area to protect and succeeded in protecting it, but that was because it was inaccessible anyway. So would that, that basically failed this counterfactual test of whether the... and of course, Verra pushed back, and full disclosure, I don't think they've certainly not accepted these allegations, but these allegations are out there, and you can see how, and they're backed up by peer-reviewed research, and you can see how it's always going to be a challenge. If you're saying this forest is standing there, I want to take credit for it, and in this neighboring region, but you have to have some kind of argument about, what would have happened if you hadn't intervened. Finally, we get on to the last category of emission reduction offsets, and this is the idea of paying somebody to store carbon back in the geosphere, to restore carbon back to the geosphere. So paying, say, a cement plant owner or power station owner to capture their carbon and stick it back underground. Those of you who are familiar with these lectures would, of course, not be surprised to hear that I'd be a huge fan of this kind of offset, but I can't show you a picture of it because it doesn't exist. It sort of illustrates a point, really. Nobody wants, everybody would love to be able to show a picture of these are the trees we're saving in Peru, and these are the wonderful birds that live in these trees, and this is the beauty of nature that we're saving with our offset program. And here's a really ugly cement plant where we fitted some, carbon capture technology to, and it's all going underground, and who cares? And that's really the problem is, the offset industry, to some extent, is living on what's decorative as well as what's effective. Moving on to carbon removal offsets, this is the other half of it, so paying somebody to take carbon back out of the atmosphere. And again, the two big categories we're talking about here, carbon removal to the biosphere, on the one hand, meaning capturing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it at the Earth's surface in living things, or carbon removal to the geosphere. So the geosphere back underground, back into rock. And we'll start with carbon removal to the biosphere because, by the way, that's pretty much the only kind you can probably afford, unless you're a billionaire at the moment. Here's one such project, a drone planting trees in Australia. This kind of technology is definitely supported by claims like, restoring forests may be one of our most powerful weapons in fighting climate change. And this is an article which came out a few years ago, essentially implying that we could capture 2/3 of man-made carbon emissions by planting forests. When you delved into it, this 2/3 number came sort of slightly out of the air. But the idea of this is you're capturing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in trees or by replanting and reforesting trees. But the challenge, of course, is what happens if the government of the country you're planting these trees in changes? I mean, these trees are being planted somewhere. They're probably being planted in many of them in a developing country. This is deforestation rates rather than afforestation rates, but it sort of makes the point. So you can see in yellow when Lula da Silva was president of Brazil, his government had a huge impact in reducing deforestation in Brazil. Then Jair Bolsonaro came in and deforestation rates went back up again. And of course, Lula da Silva is now back in again and they're coming down again. So if you're paying somebody to plant a forest somewhere, how can you be sure that the government of the country that forest exists in will keep that carbon safe forever? Indeed, do you have any right to say that the government of that country cannot touch that carbon ever, just because you've paid for it as an offset purchaser? There's real sort of carbon colonialism questions being raised around this. And so that's sort of human changes are a risk. And then there's climatic changes. For example, Shell is buying lots of offsets in British Columbia. Well, they're selling offset. They're buying large tracts of British Columbia and using that to offset their customers' emissions. But notice the colors on this graph behind me. The green indicates regions where the amount of carbon being stored in Canadian forests is going up, and the brown, the black is where it's been disturbed by other things. There's a lot of black. There's been a lot of disturbances in Canadian forests. But you'll notice there is a general tendency for sort of green further north, brown further south. The boreal forest is essentially shifting northwards with climate. So if Shell, invests in an offset, somewhere around here, and then that carbon just moves away, what happens? Do Shell say, well, climate change wasn't our fault? And Anyway, so I mean that's the other the catch. If you store carbon at the Earth's surface, it is vulnerable to climate change itself. So this is how we summed it up in a recent paper. You know, right now we're in this situation where fluxing carbon out of the geosphere, we're digging up fossil fuels, burning them, dumping the carbon in the atmosphere. There's a lot of exchange between the land and the biosphere, but at the moment we are fluxing carbon out, a net flux of carbon out of the biosphere as well, so we're deforesting, taking carbon out of the biosphere and dumping it into the atmosphere, and that's driving up the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and driving up global temperatures. If we have a sort of fully offset situation, we could, the way most people think about offsetting at the moment, achieve this sort of situation where the flow of carbon into the atmosphere from the geosphere is balanced by a net flow of carbon from the atmosphere into the biosphere. So you can see the arrows kind of add up here, so there isn't any net flux into the atmosphere anymore. But you don't need to be a scientist to realize, that's not a sustainable situation for very long. I mean, you can't keep turning rocks into trees, is the way I like to put it, because there's finite land resources in the world. If you wanted to offset our current, if you wanted to plant trees to offset our current fossil fuel use, I think you'd need an area the size of France every year. So you rapidly run out of Frances. So eventually, if we want to get to a durable net zero, we need all of these arrows to balance, and therefore no longer to be a sort of net flux from the geosphere through to the biosphere. And that means geological net zero, meaning we're putting carbon back into the geosphere at the same rate that we're taking it out. And by the way, those of you who remember my the year one lectures, and this is a little test of you actually, while all this is happening, there is still, we are relying on Mother Nature continuing to take carbon out of the atmosphere just by the natural response of the carbon cycle to our past emissions, which is essential to draw down atmospheric concentrations fast enough to stop the rise in global temperatures. But crucial to this is this geological net zero, meaning a balance of geological sinks for geological sources. If you're burning kerosene from fossil fuels, you have to achieve geological net zero, to make that process consistent with geological net zero, you have to be capturing the CO2 generated by the kerosene and sticking it back underground. So this is this principle, which is, by the way, hotly contested, and I have colleagues in Oxford who disagree with this idea that we need like-for-like offsetting, but I firmly believe we do. Happy to take questions on this. Maybe some of those people are watching online and would like to feed in some questions. So I argue, and to be fair, I think plenty of people agree with me as well, that eventually we need geological sinks to balance geological sources. If you're generating carbon from the geosphere, if you're generating carbon dioxide that comes from the geosphere, from rocks underground, you need to dispose of it in some equivalently permanent, either back into the geosphere itself or into sort of geochemical storage in the oceans. So when you're flying a plane, if you want to remove the carbon you generate from the atmosphere, so this is the whole sort of spectrum of carbon removal offsets, on the one hand, at the one extreme, you can pay for monoculture forestry, where basically people are just planting trees, very sort of boring type of forestry, very bad for biodiversity, very cheap, less than £10 a ton probably to do that. Questions over what happens to those trees in the future, because of course when you have a monoculture, it's particularly vulnerable to disease and so on. Ecosystem restoration, like planting mangroves you see there in the middle, is a lot more expensive, potentially much more durable, has many more co-benefits, many more positive side benefits. And then on the right, you're seeing the opposite extreme, where there is a plant actually currently being commissioned in Texas, where they're capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere directly with an engineered process. They're capturing the carbon dioxide, purifying it, compressing it, and sticking it back underground. So that's sort of direct air capture to geological storage. And I would argue that eventually we need like-for-like offsetting. And I fooled it, I should, to be fair, on my co-authors of the Oxford offsetting principles, not all of them agree with me on this. But eventually, I stress the word eventually, because we never said that we need this tomorrow, but we need to get there eventually because of what we might call the opportunity, or what Tim Searchinger in particular has coined the phrase, the opportunity cost of land. Opportunity cost is something that arises when something's in limited supply, and so if you use it for one thing, you can't use it for something else. And land is limited, obviously. Only, we can't change the amount of land there is on the Earth's surface. So every hectare we use to store carbon can't be used for something else, like food production. Now, you might say, well, we'll only use land that couldn't be used for food production to store carbon, but we're quite ingenious about using land for food production and so on, so it's often quite hard to say, no, this land definitely couldn't have been used for anything else. And so when we store carbon at the Earth's surface, when we create a forest or even create restore an ecosystem at the Earth's surface to store carbon, we're creating a potentially valuable resource. We're creating something that people, future governments of Brazil, for example, or just future residents of that region, might want to exploit. So even if the climate doesn't change, and even if the carbon store remains vulnerable, it remains valuable. And a valuable thing is sitting around waiting for somebody potentially to exploit it and put that carbon back into the atmosphere by deciding they want to. If future generations had faced a choice between preserving these carbon stores and producing food, they're going to produce food. That's going to happen. So and simply saying, well, no, we'll write very firm fine print into the contract to say it won't happen. I mean, that's just not going to work. If you put carbon dioxide back into the geosphere, back underground, as sort of liquid CO2 soaked back into the rock, it's completely valueless. And therefore, it's safe. So, interestingly, one of the safest things it's the safety, people worry about the safety of stored carbon. The biggest risk to stored carbon is humans. It's us. And the safest form of stored carbon is stored carbon where there really is no temptation on anybody. There's no reason for anybody to pull it out again and put it back in the atmosphere. And unfortunately, carbon stored at the Earth's surface, there's always going to be reasons to maybe change your mind and use that land for something else. So we need eventually to get to the state of 100% of our offsets being carbon removal with lowest risk of reversal. So, for example, capturing carbon from the atmosphere and sticking it back underground. And this sort of flow chart in the Oxford offsetting principles indicates how we accept that right now there's lots of different offset projects around. They're all doing valuable things. We're not suggesting that people should switch overnight, but people need to have a plan to switch their offsetting strategy, to progressively transition their offsetting strategy towards removals with this very low risk of reversal. When we say low risk of reversal, you need to be storing carbon on timescales comparable to the impact of burning a fossil fuel itself, which means thousands of years. So it's just storing carbon at the Earth's surface for a few years isn't going to cut it. Interestingly, when we first introduced this idea, we got a lot of criticism because people were saying, suddenly, offset buyers just weren't interested in nature-based offsetting at all. Even though we'd never said, don't do nature-based offsetting now, we just said you're going to need to transition to more permanent storage in the future. So we had to clarify all this in the 20, although I personally didn't think it needed clarifying. I think we made it perfectly clear in the first version of the offsets. But the reaction of the market was very much a sort of immediate, Oxford says don't use nature-based offsets. And so people rushed off and only buy geological storage. And I think that suggests there is a problem with the offset markets at the moment, which is, that they're not entirely serious in the sense that they're still subject to, I don't know if you recognize what it is behind me, this is a Birkin bag. You can buy it for £30,000 or something like that. Did it cost £30,000 to produce? No, of course it didn't. But it's scarce, and people want to be able to say, I bought a bag for £30,000 to show it off. And I think there's an element of Birkin bag effect in offset purchasing right now, that certain companies that don't need to buy very many offsets because they don't have very large emissions, but they really want to show off how good they are, don't really care what they spend on them. And so it's not an entirely serious market yet. And there is an element of just, showcasing in the way we go about offsetting. So if we're going to get serious about offsetting, we have to get serious about offsetting because there will be emissions still at the date of net zero. They will need to be addressed. We will require some offsetting of residual emissions. And that means eventually, I would argue, we need a like-for-like balance between sources and sinks, which almost certainly will mean geological storage of geological origin carbon. I think the scope for storing carbon from geological sources at the Earth's surface is limited and very possibly nil. But we also need, and just really stress this point, we need a progressive transition from here to there. We can't switch to everybody buying direct air capture with geological storage offsets tomorrow. Apart from anything else, that would make offsets completely unaffordable. And it would also destroy all these very valuable projects that are happening to restore the Earth's biosphere and so on, which are serving a very useful purpose. But if people are investing in them, they also need to be investing in permanent storage as part of their Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting strategy. And as I say, the hints in the name, we said it was about net zero aligned offsetting. We never said it was good offsetting or bad offsetting. If you want to make your offsetting strategy aligned with net zero, this is what you need to do, this progressive transition to 100% permanent storage. So hopefully that's given you some thoughts on what to do next time you're hovering over the tick box about offsetting from when you're buying a flight.
Thank you very, very much indeed.